problem that new knitters have is making a mistake and needing to go back, but not knowing how to get yourself put back together, or dropping some stitches, not knowing how to pick them up. So we're going to figure that out today. The first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to take my needle out, and so we just have loose stitches. And usually they will kind of hang out like this in a row, right? They don't just complete, the whole piece doesn't unravel. It kind of, stays a little bit. So the first thing you want to do is you want to pick up all the stitches. So you take a needle. Sometimes it's easier to do this with a needle that is smaller than the size you were knitting with. But you just want to go all the way across and put them back on. Now sometimes they might be kind of twisted around, and it doesn't matter for this step, right? It's just however you can grab them and try to get them all. The end ones are tricky. It looks like the loop is too big, but you just go straight in, okay? So now I've picked them all up, but my next step is to make sure they're all going the correct direction. And you can do this when you're knitting, or you can do it in advance, right? But each stitch, to be properly seated on the needle, the stitch needs to go like this, where the front leg goes off to the right and the back leg goes off to the left. So you can see this stitch is properly set up where that front is going off to the right. And you can kind of feel it when you're knitting, because there should be like a little piece that your right needle is easily able to grab, right? But the first row that you do after picking up lost stitches, you need to be particularly careful and keep an eye on every single stitch and make sure they're all positioned correctly. This one you can see is wrong. This one got flipped around backwards, okay? So one easy thing to do is you can just take it off and just put it right back so that you're sure that it is positioned correctly before you continue. This next one is also set up incorrectly. Another way you can solve that problem is you can simply knit through the back loop. So normally to knit, we would go in like this through, as if the needles are parallel. You go in like this, but instead you can knit through the back loop. So you insert your right needle into the part behind the left needle, like that, and then knit, and it will naturally twist that stitch back to the correct orientation for you. Okay? So that is one thing that you can do. That's the main thing. If you have to go back, that is one of the main ways to do it. Particularly if you've lost a stitch or lost a section, you just pick them back up. Another thing you can do is what's called tinking, and to tink is to knit backwards. It is literally the word knit spelled backwards, is tink. And to do this, you use your needle and you actually unknit every single stitch. So you go in the way that the yarn is coming out. Whoops, got that one, my yarn twisted around. As happens on that end stitch is tricky. So like here's the first stitch, okay? Let me try to stretch it out so you can see it. Here's the stitch below. I'm going to go into the stitch below, and then once it is safely on my needle, I will take the yarn and pull it out of that stitch. Okay, I'm going to do the next one. So you put the needle in through the stitch below, and then you can drop it off the right loop, and then you can pull out the yarn. So in this way, you can go back, if you don't have to go very far, you can go back one stitch at a time like that. I'm going to go all the way to the end of this row so I can then show you what it looks like to tink a purled row. So if you don't have to go very far, this actually is the method that I use. If I have to go a long way, if I have to go several rows back, then I will do what's called frogging, and I will just pull back. I'll take my needles out and actually just pull back several rows. And that's called frogging because you rip it as you're pulling it back. Okay, so now here I'm set up for purling. If I need to tink a purl row, you go in through the front of the stitch like that to put it on your needle. And then once it's there, you can pull that yarn out. Okay, so I sometimes kind of pull the yarn up and out of the way, so I can tell where my needle is supposed to go in. And again, you pull it off the right loop, and you're always pulling it after the next stitch below is already safely secured on your left hand needle. And you can go all the way back like that. Okay. The other thing that you can do is you can put in a lifeline stitch, a lifeline, and that will save you as a new knitter, particularly if you're doing a complicated pattern. You might want to put in a lifeline like every 10 rows or so, and that means it holds the stitches for you. So in case you had to go back, you've got your stitches saved, and you only have to rip back as far as the lifeline. So to put one in, if I wanted to put one in now, you have a couple choices. One option is just to actually take a needle and a different color thread, and you actually just put it in like right in those live stitches with your knitting needle, and you go all the way through. You might have to do 2 sections at once. I'm going to do that, so I'm just going to pull it through, and then you go through the next little section. You just weave it in, right, just like that, and then you would just keep knitting. An interchangeable needle will actually often have a small hole. You can see one right here, and it's usually where you insert the key, right? So if this is how the needle goes on, and you put the little key in here to twist it so it's locked, but it's a pretty good size hole, and you can actually thread like a piece of dental floss through here, and then you can knit just like usual, and the floss will follow your cable all the way along, and you don't have to do any extra work to create a lifeline and to add it into one of your rows. Then you can take it off, leave it threaded through your stitches just like this is, and then continue knitting. So for example, just to show you, I can just continue and just ignore that red lifeline is there, and it'll just stay there as I continue on with my work. Then I'll go 1 row past, and you'll see that when I rip it back, I don't lose those stitches. All right, here we go at the end of the row. So you see, it would just stay right here, and I could keep adding row, 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 and it would stay right there. But then if I need to rip my work back, pretend I have several more inches done, and I make a mistake and I need to go back, I can simply pull back my work, but you see right there it gets stuck. And all of my stitches are saved exactly how they're supposed to be. And so then it's very easy for me just to insert my needle, just to follow that red yarn back. It's holding all of my stitches, and it's holding them in the proper direction, so I don't have to worry about them being twisted. So you can go all the way through just like that, pick them back up. So the only caveat is you need to remember to keep moving your lifeline up, every 10 rows or so you don't lose a lot of your work. The one other thing to share is it is possible to insert a lifeline after the fact. So let's say that you realized you made a mistake, and or you even dropped several stitches significantly, but you didn't have a lifeline. You can actually add one, and you want to add it to one side of each of the stitches. It doesn't matter which side. So I'm going to use, if this right here is my stitch, I'm going to add it to this left side of the stitch. And I'm going to try to do that all the way across in the same row. So that is the biggest trick, is doing it in the same row. And I can do that all the way across. And then it creates that same lifeline as if I had done it in the row that I was knitting. You see? So then you could go ahead and safely rip your work back and know it had been saved. My last tip is, if you have a complicated pattern, you need to rip back several rows. One thing you can do is you can rip back until the row before you want to keep, And then you can tink back that last row one stitch at a time just to make sure you didn't drop any stitches. You have all of them, they're all set up in the right direction, and you're ready to continue again. That's particularly valuable, I think, if you're working with a really thin yarn. Sometimes it's hard to see those little tiny stitches. They can kind of disappear. So that's a good tip for how I would do if I had to pull back a big section in a little piece of work. I might pull back into one row before and then tink one stitch at a time on that last row so they're all set up well. So those are several options for you for how to save your work in case you have a problem and need to go back.